We have sign-up sheets, and we're going to let everybody who wants to speak before the night is over. But please, unless you're on the sign-up sheet, we're not going to call on you. We're not going to take hands up. We're not going to take lineups. We're going to call on everybody. Before we take public comment, though, Selectman Wyszynski's been kind enough to prepare some remarks, some explanatory remarks, talk about the override process a little bit, and talk about the 3 plans that have been proposed. Without further ado, Selectman Wyszynski.
Okay, this has been a long time coming, and but the purpose of this hearing is to hear from you, but we thought it would be a good idea to kind of lay a little foundation, show you the plans that are up for consideration that we'd like to hear your comments on, and explain the plan, so at least we have a kind of a base of information. As you know, there's been a override study committee that met for about a year. They met over 100 times in full committee and subcommittee. They did an amazing amount of work. And out of that process came some areas of consensus and then some areas of difference. In areas of consensus, one is that we need an operating override. That is, we need to raise taxes to pay for increased operations of our schools due to a 35% increase in the enrollment growth in the K-8, which is flowing up to the high school with no signs of abatement. We also need to handle additional classrooms. Right now what's before us is a debt exclusion override to handle the debt service, a portion of the debt service for the devotion school. So that's kind of the beginning point. But also part of this package is not only a tax increase that we're going to put before the voters, but also some non-tax fee increases and some municipal efficiencies. And the Override Study Committee came up with a package totaling about $2.8 million a year. And out of our process in analyzing it, we think we can commit to about $2 million of that. So another area of consensus was that the town and the schools are pretty well run, and the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, has already been picked. We've been going through a series of efficiencies and streamlines and trying to do more with less over a long period of time. And if you look at staffing, say, 20 years ago in the town versus staffing today, you'll see our staffing levels are, in fact, a lot lower, and we are doing stuff a lot more efficiently. So after the Override Study Committee turned in its report, the Board of Selectmen started having a series of first public hearings on the Override Study Committee report, and then we had a series of meetings that we kind of went through the Override Study Committee document, kind of section by section. And on the town website, under the category Override Central, I just clicked a little too far, you can see all the materials that the Board of Selectmen saw. It's all here, and it's all here for you to go through. And there's a lot of stuff. We went through a lot of things. But where we got to, and what we're going to be discussing tonight, are 3 plans that one of 3 plans is going to be put on the ballot, or even depending on the comments, and there could even be variations of this. But these are the 3 plans that we'd like comments on. So first, we're asking for an operating override. So what does that mean? That's we're asking the voters to vote themselves a tax increase to pay for services. And that would go into the base, and that would be a permanent tax increase. Unless, at a later date, the voters were to vote to undo it. But that hasn't happened in Brookline. So that's number one. Number two, we're also putting on a debt exclusion override to pay for the devotion school. A debt exclusion would raise taxes enough to pay for the debt service of the devotion school, and then once the devotion school is paid off, that tax would disappear. And we've done that twice in Brookline. We did it for the new Lincoln School, which was paid off a few years ago, and we also did it for the high school in the 90s, which is going to be paid off in the year 2020, which just so happens to be a couple of years after the devotion tax increase would go into effect. So let's talk about the three plans. In order to understand the three plans, there's an underlying document which I'm going to show you, but you can't really see it here, and I would strongly suggest that in order to really understand what's going on here, you go to the town website and take a look, because this is telling you what we're asking you to buy. So what you see here is, in this column are the staffing levels for different programs today. And then in this column is what the schools have determined is a fully funded operating budget. This column corresponds roughly to Group 2 of the Override Study Committee, which represents approximately 90% of what the schools have asked for in the so-called fully funded package. And then the last column represents how the schools would allocate the additional resources under the Group 1 scenario, which kind of brings me to the fact that, yes, the Override Study Committee had broad areas of consensus. They also had some broad areas of some differences, which I suspect we're going to hear from members of the Override Study Committee who I see in the audience. So out of that, and you know, some of the differences are just looking at the list. There'd be roughly 4 less K-8 classroom teachers, approximately 15 less high school teachers. There would be an elimination of the high school tutorial program under the 65% scenario, and it goes down the list. And these are the superintendent's recommendations to the school committee, but then the school committee has some budget process also that's going to happen after this. So let's get back to the different plans. Whoops, wrong one. Sorry about this. So the Plan 1, that's this line here, and Plan 1 would raise taxes by in aggregate $8.9 million, and this was a plan authored by Selectman Goldstein, which takes the fully funded scenario, removes a few items, and Selectman Goldstein can further elucidate what some of those items are, mainly administration, makes some changes to some collective bargaining assumptions, and comes up with this scenario, which would, for the median single-family home, raise taxes by $500, which represents 4.9%. Whoops. Okay, but then there's also an option for a pyramid, which we would like some feedback on, which would remove a portion for technology of about $500,000. So actually, I explained it a little in reverse. So there'd be under this scenario, there'd be 2 questions on the ballot. One that's 8.4 million, another that's 8.9 million. Whichever gets 51% wins, and that's similar to what we did in 2008. Okay, Plan 2, I originated that. Again, proposes a pyramid. The same pyramid as Plan 1. And what that does is it takes the Override Study Committee recommendation. We've adjusted some assumptions. Some assumptions were adjusted up. Some assumptions were adjusted down. And the end result is actually within a couple $100,000 of the absolute dollar amount that Group 2 of the Override Study Committee recommended. So the options there would be a $400 for a single-family home, the median single-family home, an increase of $447, or the upper part of the pyramid, $478. And then Plan 3, which was authored by Selectmen's Daly and I think Franco. You want to take?
I don't know if he wants to get on.
Well, Selectman Daly takes the Plan 2 option and adds $65,000 for some snow removal equipment for sidewalks and curbsides. And there's a slight increase from the Plan 2. So that's the override scenarios, the operating override scenarios. For the debt exclusion, there are 2 options on the table. One is a debt exclusion of $44.575 million, and what that is it would raise taxes enough to fund the debt service. We're not raising it, 44. You're not going to pay $44 million in 1 year. That would be over 30 years plus interest. And what that is the town share of the cost of the devotion school is approximately $90 million. We've reserved already. We have in our capital improvement plan $54 million. This $44 million represents the difference. We're also then adding $8 million to pay for some short-term space needs that the schools have voted, including some rentals for BEEP, modulars at the devotion school, and a few other odds and ends. At the Baker School, I'm sorry. Okay. And then the last one, the $49 million, adds another $5 million to that, which is actually about $300,000 and change of debt service, to have a little more contingency for devotion, and to also fund some short-term space needs that have not yet been absolutely identified, but we think they'll be in the pipeline. The difference between the two, 1.7% versus 1.9%. But if you were to vote yes on both of these, you would have to add it together. So the ranges of the different proposals added together would be between 6.1% and 6.9%. So that's the range of the tax increases that are currently on the table. So with that, if any of the selectmen want to add anything.
Good. Well, let me add first, since I'm Plan 1, and thank you, Selectman Waschinsky, you did a good job explaining it. Let me explain to everybody that my plan is based on my conclusion that I think the school committee and the school administration has made their basic case on their needs. I know that they may not have made the basic case at the time that the Override Study Committee completed their work, but since then, I think we've seen pretty compelling information. Compelling information leads me to the conclusion that 100 new employees in our school department is justified. They have about 1,200 employees now. The enrollment has gone up, as Selectman Waschinsky said, by about 35%, and we're talking about an increase in staffing levels of far less than 35%. So I think that they have whittled that down, and I think they've made the case for why they need that. I certainly am not a expert on pedagogical programs, and I defer to the expertise of those who are and who have presented that. I do, so in basic pedagogical needs, I'm buying 100% of what they've asked for. On the other hand, I do differ with the school administration on a couple of other points. One is their assumptions about collective bargaining. I think that they can do better on it. I think our compensation program for teachers currently is very competitive. I think our benefits are very competitive, and I think we can do better than the assumptions that the school administration has made. I also differ with some administrative needs that they've identified. They want 4 full-time equivalents as in central administration. They haven't really identified those roles yet. At the 90% funding level, they quickly go down to 2 additional central administrators. I think they can live with 2 new central administrators, given that we don't know what the roles of 4 would be at this point. High school administrators as well. You know, our enrollment bubble hasn't reached the high school yet, and I think it's premature to add as many new staff members at the high school as they've asked for. But in general, that's what you're seeing from Plan 1 is buying all the other needs that the school administration has proposed. I want to just explain quickly about the pyramid for the pyramid plan. This is for enhancement only, and that's an addition to the technology program that has been proposed. I think in my mind, the case for a pyramid is only for something additional, so an enhancement to the program. I'm not willing to roll the dice on whether a lower number works or doesn't work, but an enhancement is a choice we make. I'm not advocating for that pyramid. I'm just saying, you know, let's hear your input and whether you think that's a good idea. And that's all I've got to say. Selectman Daley.
Yes, okay. I want to explain first that the operating override is essentially money for people to put teachers in the classrooms for all these extra kids, and what goes along with that, some aides and some guidance counselors and things like that. The debt exclusion, as Neil explained, is for a bricks and mortar project, the Devotion School. And when we have had the opportunity over, I think it's been 5 months since we got the report from the Override Study Committee, to dig into the numbers they gave us and some information we felt we didn't have yet from the school committee, and we, I think, got that information. And the lower number that the Override Study Committee recommended, when the school committee went through very carefully and in detail, came out to the lower number that the Override Study Committee recommended would come out to about 65% of what the schools think they need to do the job with this many kids. I sort of worked off Neil's plan. We were working at something that was 90% of what the schools, roughly 90% of what they thought they needed. That's not everything, but we're making cuts on the town side, so I think it's enough for them to get the job done. But Selectman Goldstein thinks they need closer to 100%. So that's what some of the differences are. My plan, which is Plan 3, does just have a very little amount of money in there for some sidewalk snow removal equipment. I think that that's something that's very dear to the heart of many of our senior citizens in town, and there's lots of voters who don't have kids in the schools, so I wanted to have a little something for them. And it is really kind of small change, but I think it could make quite a difference in our commercial areas with the snow removal. Selectman Franco and I also agreed that the debt exclusion part of it should be the larger number, the 49.87 instead of the 44.57. And the reason for that is that if we borrow the lower number, we're going to have a few years in our capital improvements plan where we have almost no wiggle room for unforeseen projects coming up, for overruns on any projects we have going on, for possibly moving along some of the planning for some of the other efforts we know we need at, for instance, at Pierce School. And so we added a little more to the debt exclusion override so that there is a little more capacity in our CIP. One thing you should know is that the debt exclusion part of the override doesn't even begin to kick in until we start the borrowing, so that would be a year or two. It wouldn't all hit at the same time, right at the first year. And, you know, it's possible, depending on budgeting and so forth, that even though we would have the capacity to tax up to the full amount the first year, we might not need to do it the first year. We might be able to do a little bit.
That we won't need to use
To do
all
it
the
a little
capacity
less
the
than the
first
full amount the first year.
Good.
year. And then, one last thing, I'll just mention that this debt override is really the first in a few. We're going to probably need one down the road for the high school, and if we do another elementary school or an expansion, we'll probably need one for that. So just put that on the table.
Thank you, Selectman Waschinsky, and I think we're ready to move forward and start taking public comment on this. One ground rule first. As I said before, taking the names off of the sign-in sheets, not raised hands, not lining up. If you haven't signed in already, there's sign-up sheets here in front, and there's more out on the, in the lobby. And don't be bashful, you can come right up here, even if someone's speaking, come up and sign your name, not a problem. I'm going to allow...
Can somebody in the back bring up, you know, as they fill up, bring them up to the front, the sign-in sheets?
I'm going to allow each speaker 3 to 5 minutes to be heard, at least until it gets too late. And you'll know it's 3 minutes because I'm going to hold up my hands with 3 fingers up. That means you've been speaking for 3 minutes. It means you got 2 more minutes before I do this. That's 5 fingers, and it also means stop. So please be mindful of the limitations that we have. We have a big room. We have a lot of people who want to speak, and we want everybody a chance to be heard. If you'd start with your name and your where you are, your address, or something that identifies you, and what brings you here, and we'll take it from there. So first speaker signed up is Richard Leary. I see Dick right there in the 3rd row. Please come forward. On deck is Roger Lipson, you're next. So, you know, I'll always announce who the next person is. The next person can get up and stand behind. We'll call that the on-deck circle. Okay, thank you, Roger.
Good evening, Richard T. Leary. I'm a member of the Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors, and have with me tonight Roger Lipson, also a director of the Chamber of Commerce. I'll be brief. I'd first like to comment on the non-property tax revenue with particular reference to the proposed increase in parking meter rates. Parking meter revenue has always been viewed as a cash cow in Brookline and among other cities and towns in the greater Boston area. The proposal is to increase the hourly rate from $1 to $1.25 in the second year of the override program. This has been recommended both by the Override Study Committee and the Selectmen. It's an increase that has been in effect in neighboring communities and is probably something that our merchants could live with. We were pleased that neither the Override Study Committee or the Board of Selectmen decided to recommend an increase in parking meter violations. This has been an area of great concern to the Chamber and the merchants, and parking meter enforcement in particular, and is an area that we would like to meet with the town administrator, chief of police, and the traffic captain in the future to see if we can work out a more satisfactory arrangement as far as parking meter enforcement is concerned. The override proposals have been discussed, of course, within the Chamber of Commerce. We appreciated Selectman Daley coming to our board meeting last week and briefing us on the status of the override. We're glad to have a copy of the override amount grid this evening to review. The figures come as no surprise to us, since the impact on the commercial sector reflects the FY tax classification of 1.175, the impact of that. And again, we're grateful to the
That's 3 minutes, Dick.
I'm sorry. Again, we're grateful to the selectmen for setting that classification factor for the last 3 or 4 years. The Chamber of Commerce has 270 members. About 70% of them are small businesses. In Brookline, most small businesses, retail stores and restaurants, have lease provisions which provide that any tax increases will be passed through to the tenant. So given the dollar impact of the override on commercial properties, and just refer you to Plan 1, total tax impact, you can see that the impact on the commercial areas in dollar terms is more than double the impact on single-family homes. Given that overall impact, we would hope that when classification time rolls around in December, the present tax classification of 1.175 will be maintained. In other words, the commercial sector
I
will...
think, Dick, we're at 172.
172, 1.175, I've heard both numbers quoted, but in any event, we would hope that that present factor would be maintained so that the commercial properties would not be subject to a double whammy from both the override and any change in the tax classification factor. Thank you.
Thank you. That's almost exactly 5 minutes. Marty Rosenthal, you're next. I should have announced that you were on deck. On deck after Marty is Beth Jackson-Stram.
Thank you very much, and I commend the selectmen for the very careful and open process that you're using with this. It's difficult to be so democratic all the time, and you're doing a good job with this one. I'm here actually, Stanley Spiegel. I know I don't look like Stanley, and Stanley knows these issues much better than I do, but I'm here for Brookline PACS, which I co-chair with Frank Farlow, and we decided at a board meeting a couple of weeks ago we'd wait and see what was on the table as the cutting-edge issues and delegate to Frank and myself with Stanley as our expert to put together a statement for PACS and come here tonight. And I did get to talk to the two of them over the last week, but I was busy with a big work project until the end of Tuesday and haven't really focused on the details. So I'm mostly reading what Stanley prepared for me, and I'm hoping I don't get questions, which I probably won't anyway. As you won't be surprised, Brookline PACS fully supports the need for an override to enable the schools to cope with enrollment increases, sufficient teachers, guidance, and other important support staff, up-to-date technology, etc. Public education has always been a huge priority for Brookline PACS, which is now in its 53rd year. I speak personally as a graduate of the Devotion School, the Brookline High School. Brookline schools and my parents were the most important thing in my life until the Vietnam War, and that became the three most important things in my life in terms of what I've done since then. So nobody knows the value of Brookline education better than I do, and my daughter's about to graduate from the high school and got into the college of her choice already. So I value Brookline education, as does PACS. We will support, I'm sure, the maximum override that's on the ballot. And that's not just because we're tax and spend liberals, which we get called. People can look at brooklinepacs.org and see what we've stood for 53 years. But it's more than that. We understand the importance of education to our community. We understand the importance of education and all the town services to the property values of the homeowners in Brookline. I was lucky enough in 1978, with help from my parents, to get a two-family house in Brookline in my old neighborhood, and I know what the property values have done in Brookline since at least then, and probably before that. So, and a lot of that is because of who comes here, because of the services, because of education, and of course location helps as well. We're also not unmindful of the hardships from high taxes. And even though we get called tax and spend liberals, we know that taxes are a hardship. That's 3 minutes, or I have 3 minutes left?
2 minutes.
Sorry, okay. What we want to propose, we're not sure that we want to take the risk on a zero option and a failed override. And we want you to think about the possibility of the two-tier option, of a pyramid option, the higher amount and the lower amount, and let the voters decide, which would be a democratic principle as well. We would work for the higher amount, but just to hedge the bets, to think about having the middle amount or the lesser amount as a second option. And we would definitely work for the higher amount. We would do our best to mobilize our members to educate the community that this is necessary. Brookline is a well-run community, with the exception maybe of myself when I was on the Board of Selectmen in the 80s, with Mr. Leary as our leader, as the executive secretary and the first town administrator. It's been a well-run community with good government. There is not a lot of waste in Brookline. You can find nickels and dimes anywhere, but it's a well-run community, and we think we can make that case to the community that this is not wasteful, it's necessary for the heart and soul of Brookline. Finally, once this is done, we look forward to working with the school committee, whatever gets through, to help lobby them for what we think their priorities should be in the future. We're confident that at this point we don't see a lot of talk about getting rid of METCO, for instance, but that's the kind of thing we would really be against, and we'll work with them in the future as well. So thank you again for your process, and I wish I were Stanley Spiegel tonight.
Thank you, Marty. Beth Jackson Stram, and then Dick Banky, you're next.
Good evening. My name is Beth Jackson Stram. I am a resident in Precinct 1, and I served on the Override Study Committee. It's good to see you all again. I am here tonight to advocate for Plan 1A and D. And the reason is, first of all, addressing the pyramid structure. I do not believe that providing voters an option to not fund technology investments is really a real option. First, because we're not talking about providing enhancements to school technology. We're talking about providing very basic access to technology and equity across the schools. This is not something fancy, but this is something to bring us back up to the 21st century and where other schools in our region are already providing students. The schools plan, in the various scenarios that you saw Selectman Wyszynski present to you earlier, in each of those plans, the schools indicated that they would make investments in that technology in any scenario. So if voters don't vote for this, this is something that the schools will need to invest in regardless, and I don't think that it's really a true option to put it on the ballot to say, should we or should we not fund this? Why a higher operating figure? It has been 7 years since the last override, and we have had an enrollment crisis that has grown beyond anybody's ability to predict. We also have several future risks. As you all know, I spent a great deal of time on the Override Study Committee modeling, and I fully understand what the sensitivities are to things like collective bargaining amounts, as well as sensitivities to increases in enrollment, and they are not in the 100,000 levels. We're talking about changes in millions of dollars to what would be the impact on the schools. So lower funding risks continued underfunding of our crowded schools, and it also risks needing to return to voters again for more operating funds when we know we have increased needs for or additional needs for debt overrides in the very near future. We've also all been talking quite a lot about enrollment, and what is less talked about and critical, I think, for people to understand is that the schools are also serving more students in regular education classrooms with special needs, more students living in poverty, more students who are English language learners, all in the context of larger class sizes. The achievement gap is not closing, and indeed, without the level of investment that is put forth in Plan A, the situation is likely to worsen. We cannot afford not to adequately support these students. So finally, why option D on the debt exclusion? Schools across the system, not just Devotion School, are overcrowded. Baker, Pierce are experiencing higher class sizes today, having children eat lunch at 10:30, and taking breakout groups in stairwells, and that is happening today. This is not a future problem, this is today. If enrollment continues unabated, we need the flexibility to be responsive to that and have money to invest in smaller projects to relieve the overcrowding in these schools, and do it without reducing our upkeep of town sidewalks, parks, and areas that are used by all Brookline residents. In sum, I think this is the plan that will best ensure that Brookline continues to support high-quality schools and can meet the diverse needs of all the children who attend our school system. Thank you.
Thank you. Dick Banka and Sarah Bowes is after that.
Thank you. Dick Benka. I was co-chair of the Override Study Committee. I'll first address the framing of the questions. The draft states that the override is for additional enrollment. What it should say is for additional enrollment, new programs, subsidies to other municipalities, and wage increases well beyond inflation. The OSC majority recommendation funded all demonstrated impacts of enrollment growth and all existing programs. In actuality, the school department wants new programs. When the OSC was doing its work, the department explicitly stated that it was seeking enhancements as well as catch-ups. The proposed wording ignores that fact. The school department also wants funding for wage increases well beyond inflation. 2/3 of teachers and others, including a number of administrators, get automatic step increases each year. The recommended 1.5%, 2% increases over 3 years, together with those teacher step increases, would amount to an average 18% increase, and that number would be built into the base. 18% is in stark contrast to inflation, which for the last 3 years has been running at 1.5% per year, the number that also sets increases for many pensions, including mine. Likewise, again for those on fixed income, Social Security increases have been only 1.6% per year. Regarding subsidies to other municipalities, we continue to admit and assign a growing number of non-resident students before we know the number of resident students or the system's ability to handle them. We're effectively reimbursed 12 cents on the dollar for non-resident students, and that means that we're subsidizing other municipalities to the tune of $7 million per year. Next, the reference to $682,000 for municipal departments. These impacts could come into play only if four things all happen. First, the board refuses to put a lower and broadly acceptable override option on the ballot, and as a result, the override fails. Then the board fails to put a new acceptable override question before the voters, something that you could do 35 days after filing with the town clerk. And the board and school committee don't use their authority to raise fees. And finally, we have revenues that are actually limited to our current conservative estimates. That hasn't been the case over the last 3 budget cycles. What has happened is that our actual tax levy, local receipts, and state aid have exceeded our conservative estimates by $3.5, $6.6, and $6.6 million. Cuts are simply not a given. History indicates that there will be more than enough funding to avoid cuts even without the override. Finally, the need for an educated electorate. The board must take a leadership role in explaining the full impact of this override and likely future overrides, not minimizing future costs to achieve a political end. To give an idea of the potential impact of coming tax levy increases, even without an override, taxes on the median condo have gone up 6%, on rental properties 12%, and on commercial properties 8%, as a result of reassessments and the resulting tax shifting. The override is now framed as adds another 6 to 7%. Every year there's a further 2.5% increase, and actually for those who don't get abatements, it's more like 3% a year, or more than 15% over 5 years. The 5-year CIP identifies 2 major additional projects that are both already under study, the high school and a major K-8 project, especially with Hancock Village looming. Consultants for the schools have estimated $225 million for the high school alone. Even cutting that in half, you're talking an additional 11 or 12% in debt service and operating expenses for the 2 projects. With these projects, for condos, even without further reassessments or additional overrides, you're looking at potential tax increases in the range of 36 to 40% a year. 30% or more for single-family homes, where taxes are already in the top 5 in the state, and 40% or more on apartments and commercial properties. The retirement of the existing high school debt in fiscal year 20 would save 0.5%. To conclude, although you may personally favor a higher number, I urge you to present the full picture of the coming tax tsunami and to put the majority OSC recommendation on the ballot for political certainty, to ensure that citizens can get behind at least one override option that will pass. We need to be transparent and to show restraint, or we could become a community where small businesses are replaced by chains, where the middle class is replaced by the very wealthy, and where seniors are forced out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Sarah Bowes is next, and then Brian Bergstein after that.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bowes. I live on Aspinwall Avenue. I have a second grader at Lawrence and also a pre-kindergarten student. I'm here to support Plan 1, A and D, the higher override bundle and higher debt exclusion for devotion, and for putting money into the CIP. I think it's critical to fully fund our schools at 100% or close to 100% of the levels the schools are telling us that are needed. Obviously, we've already been seeing increased class sizes. We've already been falling behind in technology. I know my son's teacher recently came to Brookline Schools from another district and was already quite surprised at how far behind in technology we were compared to where she had been previously. And if we aren't fully funding the schools, that's just going to be a situation that's going to get worse and worse, and that's not going to be good for our kids or for our property values. You know, and I think when I look at the grid, the total tax impact grid of these different scenarios, it's interesting to me just to see that, you know, with all these different possibilities that are being considered, the difference between the highest amount and the lowest amount for single-family, the median single-family home is $101 a year, and for condos is $31 a year. it seems like, all of these different scenarios the changes amount to very little difference for an individual household over the course of a year, whereas the impacts to the schools between these different scenarios could be very great. And I think it's certainly possible that there's a lot of people that might, not vote for an override in any amount, but for people who might vote for an override, I don't know that this $31 or $101 is going to make a big difference in their vote. And so I think that, that if you're going to ask the voters to approve an override and debt exclusion, it seems like you might as well ask for what you really need, the 100% or close to it of what's really necessary, as opposed to shortchanging yourself for such a little amount per household. I'm not in favor of the pyramid. It just seems like it's very confusing to voters, and as someone else had said previously, it doesn't really seem like a good option to not have this investment in technology, which is really needed. And then on the debt exclusion amounts, I certainly agree with what was said earlier, just that we shouldn't be just funding devotion. We should fund devotion, but that we should also be putting money back into the CIP, since we absolutely know it's going to be needed. And although I know there's people that think that we need to identify today exactly what those amounts are going to be needed for, I think that's not realistic, and that it's good to have some amounts there that you can use as you determine which projects need to be funded and when, and not to completely tap out the CIP. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brian Bergstein and then Rick Stram.
Thank you. My name is Brian Bergstein. I live in Brookline Village. I have 2 children at the Pierce School. I'm on the Pierce School Council, and I've been following this process relatively closely, been at a few of these meetings, and I wanted to thank the Board of Selectmen for all the really good work you've put into this, and the sort of, I think, intellectual honesty with which you've approached this project. So much of what the previous speaker said and the woman before her said, I wouldn't want to repeat. I certainly echo it. I support options 1A and 1D. Just to further what was just said, when I look at the difference between 1A and 1B, I think that what you're looking at is a difference in a tax increase to the median single-family home is a difference between $495 a year and $526 a year. That's 30 cents a week. And why not just show the leadership and the clarity of asking for what we really need? So, but money is a difficult thing, and I realize that I might look at those charts and say that I'm willing to swallow a 5, 6, 7% tax increase, and I surely understand that money means different things to different people. I also do not want to live in a community where poor or middle-class people are priced out. One of the things, obviously, we love about Brookline is its diversity, but one of the things I think that we can all agree on, while money can be tough to agree on, one of the things we can agree on, and usually do, I've noticed, is that we all basically think Brookline is an excellent place to live. We expect and are fortunate to have excellence in our library, in our police department, in our parks, in our snow plowing, you name it. This is a wonderful place to live. And that notion of excellence is across the sort of first or second sentence of a lot of communications that we parents get from the schools. Brookline Public Schools are committed to providing an excellent educational experience to our families. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we are not at excellence right now in our schools. And much as we would not accept a pretty good police department teetering on the edge of going downhill, we shouldn't accept it in our schools. And so again, I know the money can mean different things to different people, but what we should agree on is that we want excellence from our schools. Excellence from our schools is not only a value that we benefit from. Sure, our kids get the benefit of a wonderful public education, but the fact that this is a town with such good public schools is something that makes us stronger as a community, because so many people go to public schools. This isn't a town where a large percentage of the wealthy send their kids to private schools and everybody else fends for themselves in the public schools. It's actually a very egalitarian and diverse public school system. But the truth is that, I will definitely get within the next 2 minutes. The truth is that we are not at excellence in our public schools. The schools have been, if we're honest with ourselves, running on fumes for the last few years. So whether you want to call some of these proposals enhancements or new programs, it doesn't matter. The truth is, the schools are barely getting by. And I think they're frankly only getting by because of the ingenuity and the commitment and the persistence of Dr. Lupini, of the principals I see, the teachers. But I have to say that if you spend time in the schools, and I hear it in school council meetings, there's a feeling of we don't know how much more creativity and ingenuity we can bring to bear on an enrollment that's out of control. The enrollment increase is undeniable. No one's saying, boy, we don't really need to add on to the devotion school. Boy, we don't really need these modular classrooms in Baker. The enrollment numbers are off the charts, and it's undeniable. What also goes with that are more teachers, more counselors, things that basically have not kept pace in the last few years. And I would say we have a school system right now that is trying awfully hard for excellence, is maybe not there. And what's really at stake in this vote is, do we want an excellent school system, or are we willing to let a very good school system that's struggling perhaps teeter into crisis and fiasco? We would not accept that in any other department in this town, and I don't think we really want to accept it in our schools. So all I'm saying is, let's try to get beyond the numbers, an extra 30 cents a week, property tax increase, in 1A versus 1B. Hey, you know what? But I think the question really here is, do we want excellence across the board, and do we want to keep up the reputation that Brookline has earned in its schools, or just want to get by on reputation alone? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rick Stram, and then Robert Miller.
Good evening. I'm Rick Stram. My wife Beth and I live with our 3 kids on Powell Street. We have a first grader and a third grader in devotion, and a little guy who will go to devotion in the fall of 2016. We moved to Brookline because it's a wonderful community. Obviously, the proximity to Boston was an attraction, but above all, the quality of education was what brought us here. And I know that's we seem to be kind of pursuing a popular option based upon the enrollment growth, and here we are. I'm glad to see that the Board of Selectmen are overall in favor of funding school operating needs. I personally support Plan 1A and D, the higher override bundle at $8.9 million, $8.95 million, and the higher debt exclusion for devotion. I do not support a ballot question with a pyramid structure. I think making technology funding optional, given the state of technology as it exists today in the schools, is a mistake. I also think it will unnecessarily confuse voters who also already have to grapple with the debt exclusion issue. I think the override will help ensure that, number one, Brookline can continue to support high-quality education and small class sizes for all students. Second, that schools can provide basic and equitable access to technology across schools and students. And third, that enough capital funding can be in place so we can afford to do right by devotion and also be responsive to the other immediate space needs in the schools without starving the budgets of the town's parks, open spaces, streets, and sidewalks that all of our citizens use. And as was said earlier, this is not just about funding a future enrollment growth problem. It's about relieving the overcrowding and budget constraints we are already experiencing. We've had K-8 enrollment growth of more than 35% since 2006 that hasn't been supported yet with similar growth in revenue, in part due to the constraints by Proposition 2.5. Kindergarten classes have grown from below 500 students to now 700, almost 700 this year. You can't grow like that and expect the same quality of education if the budget does not keep up. Meanwhile, our school technology is in the dark ages. We must provide all students with a 21st century education, and not just for those kids who can afford technology access at home, or those schools whose parents donate equipment. And speaking about room in schools, and I can speak personally about devotion, there's just no room. There's been temporary classrooms put up all over the place. When you drop kids off in the morning, you cannot even get through the hallway. After-school programs are on top of the kids at the end of the day. Common area space is just completely inadequate. As was stated earlier, the lunch shifts start at 10:30 in the morning. So I look forward to a successful outcome of the override again, hopefully with Plan 1A and D, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Robert. Robert Miller next, and then Jody Curran.
Hi, my name is Robert Miller. I live at 19 Copley Street. I'm also a Heath School teacher and a town meeting member for Precinct 8. In full disclosure here, I actually signed in thinking I was signing in, not signing up, but I'm really glad I did. I have some things to say, and I'm going to try to be coherent in how I present them. So maybe you'll forgive me if I'm not quite as polished as I should be. So first of all, I wanted to address some of the teacher issues, and I want to thank Selectman Goldman for recognizing the needs at the schools. I'm also going to try not to repeat things that have been said before, but I will quibble with the belt tightening of the teachers. Teachers have tightened their belts a lot and have had way less than cost of living increases for quite some time now, with increasing workloads. The teaching, the class sizes have gone up, I would say, between 40 and 50%. When I started teaching, and I'm a career changer, when I started teaching 11 years ago, my class sizes were around 17, 18. 2 years ago, I had 27 in my class, and, we don't see anything under 20 hardly anymore. So the class sizes have gone up tremendously. Also, when I want to justify to Mr. Benke why that is, in fact, less than a cost of living increase. The way the teaching the way a career is set up for teachers is that there are step increases, because otherwise what you would have is entry-level teachers staying for a few years and then moving on, because there is no tiered system. There's no hierarchy of where you're going to go unless you're going to become a principal, and there's many, many teachers who do not want to go into administration, don't want to be vice principals. They want to make their careers as teachers. And so unless you just have an entry-level wage, and what you do is just give some cost of living increases to that entry-level wage, it doesn't work. And I don't want to get too caught up in the weeds, but the fact of the matter is those step increases are not cost of living increases. They are how the profession is set up. The other thing that I want to talk, I also want to just address briefly that the school department and the schools have worked really hard, as the previous speaker was talking about, at filling the holes in the dikes, sticking their fingers in the holes, trying to keep everything at a top level while these enrollments have gone up 35% without the money to correspond. Having come from the private sector, it was really interesting to see what's happened over the last 5-7 years. In the private sector, you have a 30% increase in your customers. You get more than a 35% increase usually in your bottom line, or at least in your gross revenues. And we were facing cutbacks from the state and the federal funding. So it was really counterintuitive coming from the private sector to see how this works. Increasing enrollments, no increasing monies. And the easiest way, actually, to cut back on the increased enrollments is not at all what this town wants, which is for the schools to deteriorate. And all you have to do is look at our borders and look at the property values on either side of our borders. And you can see that living in Brookline is not living across our border in terms of what the properties cost. And that's not because you can't use location if you're looking at a border. It's not that we're closer to parks, it's not that we're closer to Boston, it's that we have schools that you don't have in our neighboring communities. So, and the last thing that I wanted to talk about is I've run into lots and lots of people who have talked about, well, you know, there's so many people that don't have kids in schools, and I don't have kids in schools. I pay the taxes. I'm a homeowner here, and I'm happy to pay the taxes, not because I'm a teacher, but because this is what I value. I value education. I value living in a community that values education. I value the neighbors that I have who have kids in school. I'm happy to pay for...
It's 5 minutes, sir.
Okay. So, and one last thing. I don't think that we should be talking about whether we want to pay for elderly or we want to pay for roads because we don't drive and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Jody Curran, and then Leonard Awebs after that.
Good evening. My name is Jody Curran, and this is my 26th year as an educator in Brookline. I also live in Brookline, and my 2 daughters went through the Brookline school system. In addition to teaching at Devotion and Driscoll schools, I also teach a Wednesday afternoon retail class to teachers that is mandated by the State Department of Education for license renewal. Finally, I'm also active in the Brookline Educators Union. My point for this lengthy introduction is that I'm about as connected to Brookline and the Brookline Public Schools as one can be. Most teachers realize that there is great value in teaching in a community like Brookline. Citizens here care deeply about education, and the town works hard to put resources into the schools. Lately, though, there have been additional challenges for educators, as many people here have spoken to, including an increase in student assessments, state mandates like retail, more crowded schools, and the pressure to move toward more and more individualization of instruction. We've been patient with the town's growing school population, which began a decade ago and has continued steadily over time. We have not laid excessive demands on the town or school department during this time, and we have been fiscally responsible. For example, we've been working this year without a contract renewal, and we agreed to consider a 1-year proposal to give the town time to deal with the many concerns surrounding the override. We worked with the town and other unions following the financial crash in 2008, and together moved employees into the cost-saving GIC. It's time now for the town to deal with the funds needed to continue to make the Brookline Public Schools the beacon of learning it is well known for. Educators, the backbone of this system, are saddened when we hear that some town leaders have said that we should be tightening our belts as the town goes forward with an override proposal. Through our skill and expertise, we've helped make the Brookline Public Schools a magnet for scores of new families who flock to Brookline to be part of this great community. The need for an override is not because the economy is crashing, but because more and more people want what we have to offer. With all due respect, then, how insulting is it when teachers hear that we should adopt an austerity mentality around our salaries, wages, and compensation? We urge you to fully fund our schools in the future, to take a long view of education and where it fits into the culture of this town. And that includes keeping staff levels adequate and fairly compensating our educators and celebrating their successes. You can lead the way in this conversation. You can help voters understand the issues at hand and the future ramifications of the decisions you make today. I urge you to put forward an honest request that will fully fund the kind of schools we want to have here in Brookline. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Leonard Awebs, and then Carol Levin, please.
Len Weiss.
Oh, Len Weiss, I'm sorry.
actually signed up twice. Do I
Did
get
you
10
write
minutes?
Leonard A., your handwriting,
Yeah, it's
Lenny,
close.
that's the problem, all right.
The other list where I get my
Thanks.
second 5 minutes has run clear.
Thanks. Lenny Weiss and then Carol Levin, please.
Okay, I'm Len Weiss of 46 Hawthorne Road. I had three children go through the Brookline school system. I'm a member of the advisory committee, and I chair its school subcommittee. More revenue is needed to ensure the quality of our children's education. Those not overburdened with money realize that all wants cannot be had and all necessities not fully satisfied. Government can satisfy all wants, but responsible elected officials must consider the mutual best interests of all residents. The overarching objective was to understand the resource requirements of the schools and to develop a reasonably sustainable financial plan. The OSC was a valuable resource in this undertaking. School buildings are under-equipped and undersized before consideration of Hancock Village. Valuable human resources are needed, education methods are changing, the list goes on, but we have not grasped that understanding or the magnitude of the total investment. Yet taxpayers will vote on a large down payment, 3 years on the operating side and 1 building on the capital side, most unaware that multiple large overrides for future operations and capital projects are assured, and all not knowing the magnitude. Collaboration is compromise of unyielding ideology and the recognition that 100% of wants cannot be had. We have polarization, we have we are the schools, we don't have we are Brookline. The schools appear as a self-governing entity whose requirements the town funds without constraint. Collaboration with the OSC was practically non-existent. School officials opposed meaningful ideas. They offered no self-initiated ones. The time-worn weapon of cutting popular school programs was deployed to mobilize parents, students, and teachers. The schools have not shown imagination and leadership. There are opportunities to lower the financial burden and achieve desired outcomes. The schools characterized a November 2013 presentation to the OSC as mere compliance with a request and not an ask. Going out as far as 2022, the horizon narrowed to 3 years. The OSC minority and majority inductively determined recommendations were provocatively mislabeled the 90% and 65% solutions derived from the school's 100% fully funded solution. In school jargon, that's an A+, an A-, and an F for failing. By November 14, that not an ask morphed into a dire warning imaged with an about-to-drown polar bear. This month, the dire warning grew with larger enrollment assumptions. To my knowledge, the warning does not bear the imprimatur of a vote of the school committee or its finance subcommittee. There has been no substantive due diligence by the town or the OSC, yet we are asking voters to raise their taxes. The so-called 100% solution and the mislabeled 90% solution are substantially the same. Differences will be absorbed in the next override. COLA increases will be managed through artful construction of collective bargaining agreements. Line item deletions by the town won't survive. Lower pricing assumptions, not fewer resources, cosmetically reduced the dire warning from over 15 million to over 12 million. Short-term leases were returned incorrectly to the capital budget, continuing to mask an operating issue. These actions cloud the understanding of a sustainable financial plan. Calling the 65% solution a non-starter is unchallenged acceptance of the dire warning. It dismisses the OSC's intellectual insight as well as common sense. It denies that quality education could be achieved with fewer resources. A lower override is available by using unspent prior year's schools' general fund appropriations. It's 1.5 million now and probably another 500,000 by the end of the fiscal year. This would put the schools under the standards faced by the town and subject them to the discipline of reserve fund transfers. It's a wonderful opportunity to improve transparent disclosure and reforms the town's interaction with the schools. The inclusion of snow plowing seems like a bit of a crumb for non-school interests. If it's that important, just do it without an override. I recommend a downsized single option reflecting the issues I've identified. In the interim, through the next override, improve collaboration and leadership, understand resource requirements, and develop a reasonably sustainable financial plan. This large down payment without such is premature and puts the immediate need for added revenue at serious risk of failure.
Thank you, Lenny. Carol Levin, and then Alessandra Cardiso, I think.
Hi there, I'm Carol Levin, a 25-year resident of Brookline. I have two children who attended Runkle and both graduated from BHS in 2008 and 2012. And I was a member of the OSC, the Override Study Committee, on both the Capital Subcommittee and the Fiscal Policy Subcommittee. And now I'm on the town's Economic Development Advisory Board, and I am very concerned with the long term, the future going forward, and the ability of this town to plan for what will come in the future and what it's going to take to meet the needs of its citizens going forward. I too am very troubled by the proposals that are being put forward. I do believe we need to fund the debt exclusion for the devotion school. I am not comfortable with the D exclusion, the higher one. I feel that absent firm plans, we shouldn't be borrowing extra money. But I'm most concerned about the level of the override. I was a member of the majority who voted for the $5 million override for all of the reasons that you've heard and you will continue to hear tonight. I am very troubled that the conversation among the selectmen and here tonight is focused on what we need rather than what we can afford, because that's the important issue. The question going forward is, can the cost structure of the schools be sustained into the future? In the 21st century, should we be maintaining a 20th century cost structure, or is it time to be looking for new solutions? I've heard a lot of talk this evening about excellence in education. I hear the fear of the parents here that somehow their children are going to be shortchanged. I am not an educational expert. There were certainly other members of the Override Study Committee who this is their bailiwick and area of expertise. But I can tell you, I can promise you as a parent, no matter how much money we give to the public schools, there are going to be times that you are just going to be sorely disappointed in the experience that your children have. I promise you, I had one child who went through Runkle in classes of 24 to 25 and another child who went through Runkle with classes of 19 through 20. The great teachers were always great, regardless of the size of the class. The good teachers were good, and the bad teachers were just horrible, very consistently. The building was old, the space was insufficient, and many areas were suboptimal. I can tell you my children have come out the other end, and they did just fine, and they are very happy with their Brookline education overall, though they have many comments that they will tell you how they were hurt by the educational experience and how they wish something else happened. But those answers to those problems have nothing to do with money. They have to do with decisions that were made by the leadership, whether that be the principal or the central administration. We moved to Brookline 25 years ago, not just for the schools, not just for the proximity to Boston, but also for the rich socioeconomic diversity of the town. Here, unlike many of the more affluent western suburbs, our children had the enriching opportunity to go to school with children from families which were not just like theirs. Not just because they might have two moms or dads, not because they might have a different skin color or speak a different language at home, but because their parents were just as likely to be a teacher, a nurse, a social worker, a building inspector, as a doctor, a lawyer, or as an academic. Because going to school with a child whose father was a janitor, who couldn't go to birthday parties or was hesitant to go to birthday parties because they couldn't afford to buy a present, taught my child compassion and empathy, which is an important part of your child's educational experience also. By going to school with a child who needed to arrange her course schedule so she would have time to have a part-time dog walking job, a choice which was not a reflection of wrong priorities, but rather a cold economic reality. And by going to BHS with a child who was pulled from class and threatened with expulsion because she was no longer a legal resident of this town, because her family was officially homeless, well, my child learned that sometimes, even in progressive, relatively affluent communities like Brookline, there are friends and neighbors in need or forgotten and sometimes ignored. These children were our neighbors. They were not beneficiaries of the METCO program. They were not even residents of public housing projects, but they were our neighbors. I feel the current override proposals are not only ignoring so many of our neighbors who live with limited resources, but will further push out the remaining middle-class residents of towns, residents whose presence are responsible in part for what makes Brookline such a great community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Levin. Alessandra De Crediso, and then David Knight.
Alessandra Di Credico. I live in 181 Davis Avenue. I'm a parent of 2 children that go to Runkle, but I'm also here as a CPAC representative of Runkle. So CPAC is the Special Education Parents Advisory Committee. So I will tell you a little bit about my experience, but I also give voice to people who cannot be here tonight. And definitely our preferences for Plan 1A and D. We would like to have the public school of Brookline fully funded. The reason is that we are really representing a particular vulnerable part of this society. When we moved here in Brookline, my husband and I, it was 15 years ago, and we had no children. Really, we could live everywhere. And we decided to live here because of the quality of life. It's a beautiful place to live. And, well, the fact that the schools were good was a good fact, but not really a fundamental fact. Years later, when my son was born and was diagnosed with a pretty severe disability, I found that being here in Brookline was a blessing. And I really thank God for helping me choose this place because of the public school of Brookline. We start with BEEP, which was the early education program, which is an exceptional program. You cannot find it anywhere else, and it turns lives around. There are kids who change their course of life because of the quality of the services that they receive in this particular service, and we have many witnesses to that. And then we have equality in the teacher and in the specialists, in the people who help us really keep this system together that cannot be paired. Said that, I'm here as an old parent, so I've seen this for many years, and I've seen that in the last few years things start changing. The number of kids enrolled not only increases in the regular classrooms, but increases also, of course, in the special ed classrooms, and this is my personal experience. So there are many more kids enrolled, and you can see that in the number of kids in the classrooms, and the teachers are strained. And we love our teachers, they are amazing, but they work a number of hours that I wouldn't really wish anybody to work. I find them at school at 6 p.m. in the evening, and they are at school at 6:30 or 7 a.m. in the morning, every single day. So they're really strained. We need more funding so that they can continue doing their job. So that's the reason for us to really invite the people who do not have our experience, and we don't wish it to anybody, to really struggle for life. Our kids cannot choose a different place to be educated. There is a public school. Otherwise, unfortunately, out of district is not a good option, and we don't want to actually burden the town with more cost than that. So public school is our place. We cannot go anywhere else. And they receive an exceptional, education that we already see strained by a reduced budget. So we are really very strongly advocating for having the highest possible override in the ballot, and also to have a single question, because it's extremely confusing to put a choice, and honestly there are many, many reasons for people say, why should I pay more if I can pay less or nothing? So let's be considerate about the future of education in Brookline, and especially remember people who cannot really advocate for themselves easily. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Crediso. David Knight, and then Lydia Schreier. David's passing. Lydia Schreier, you're next, and then Naomi Swetzer.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Lydia Schreier. I have 2 children in the Driscoll School. I also want to thank you for your efforts to make the process of developing an override question such a thoughtful and inclusive one. I listened in to your meeting last week, and I learned a lot, and I found the discussion very clear and measured and respectful, so thank you. I'd like to address 2 areas that are 2 of the main areas open for public comment: the shape of the question and the elements to include. First, you've asked whether to present the question as bundled or in a pyramid format, and I think you've heard quite a bit of support in favor of a bundled question, and I would agree. The pyramid question suggests that enhanced technology is optional, a nice program to have, but not integral to the schools, continuing to provide an excellent education to an increasing number of students. While this approach may have made sense to the world language program in the 2008 override, it doesn't seem prudent in this day and age to consider optimizing the technology available for our children's education to be optional. Further, it's at the as I understand it, it's at the school department's discretion how to use the funds it has available to it. So if an override should pass for any amount, the school department may decide to allocate less to another item to preserve funds for at least some of the technology enhancements. Finally, nobody wants to face another override vote anytime soon, a real risk if we trim the amount in this year's question. As it's been said, the difference between an individual household or business between the largest and the smallest amount is relatively small. If we agree an override is critical for Brookline Public Schools to continue to provide a high-quality education to a growing student body, let's give the school department the funds it perceives necessary to do the job, the full amount. Line A, Plan 1. Regarding the debt exclusion, all I have to say is if you've ever done a construction job, a renovation, you know that you run into unanticipated costs, and you need to be prepared for those, or you'll be asking for another debt exclusion soon. So that would be line D. The second issue I want to speak to is the question of how to attract voters to the override if they do not have children in the schools. There are all sorts of good reasons, and we've heard some of them, that you can just believe that education is good. There's also the idea of the funds for sidewalk snow removal. That's one way, although the amount was so thoughtfully whittled down that it's now so small and so clearly not related to the purpose of the override that I wonder at its place in the question. And honestly, I agree with what another speaker said, which is if improving sidewalk snow removal is a public safety issue, then I expect the town to find funds within its budget to do the job right. What seems to me to be the much more compelling argument for all Brookline residents to vote for the override is the $682,000 the town will have to absorb to cover the cost of increased enrollment in the schools with no catch-up or enhancements. There's no guarantee that this override will pass, and that's a lot of money. Without an override, the town will have to make some cuts. One idea that's been on the table is cutting funds to Brookline Community Mental Health, where members of my extended family received kind and expert care when they needed it most. Another idea is to close the Putterham branch of the public library. Other ideas involve cuts to important departments like fire and police. These are concerns that have broad community appeal and have received relatively little attention. The time for persuading voters to support the override will come shortly. I appeal to you now to present the community with a clear question that asks for enough funds for the schools to keep apace with enrollment without compromising quality of education they provide, and protects the town from having to make cuts that would compromise the quality of the community life we all enjoy in Brookline. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi Swetzer, and then Karen Krant is next.
My name is Naomi Schweitzer, and I live at 14 Griggs Terrace. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 10 and a member of the Pierce School Site Council. I have an 8-year-old at Pierce School and a 3-year-old at the BEAT program at the Lynch Center. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I support override option 1A and debt exclusion D. At Pierce School, enrollment has grown by 51% in the last 7 years, from 545 students to currently, I think the number today is 822. It might be a little lower, a little higher. The building is bursting, and I know many of the other schools are as well, all contributing to the 35% enrollment increase townwide that we're all talking about. More children means we need more classroom teachers, more art, gym, and music teachers, more support staff, and more space. I feel at this time that we are at a tipping point where the educational quality and equity will diminish despite the amazing efforts of our school staff if we do not provide our schools with the funding they need. Educating children is labor-intensive and worth the investment. Class size matters. Being able to attract the best teachers matters. Having aides in all of our K through second grade classrooms matters. The quality and upkeep of school buildings matter. MECO and the diversity it brings matters. And having 21st century technology for kids going into a world where they will need technology skills to be employable matters. Earlier this month, Sean Cronin, Deputy Town Administrator, made a presentation to the Board of Selectmen showing that among Massachusetts towns, Brookline ranks at the low end for tax increases and at the high end for government efficiency. It's a great presentation. Our tax rate growth over the last decade is the lowest among 15 comparable towns. Among all Massachusetts towns, our tax rate growth is in the bottom 20%. We run a tight ship. I support option 1A because it's the option that comes closest to fully funding our schools, and I support a single override question rather than a pyramid because technology should not be considered an optional expense. And I support the larger debt exclusion because the smaller exclusion would put us irresponsibly close to maxing out our borrowing capacity and not give us the flexibility we need to meet our capital needs. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I should point out that the technology enhancement is part of the school budget, even with no override. It's really an enhancement on an enhancement that the pyramid proposal you've seen would provide. And again, I'm not advocating for it, but soliciting input. Karen Krant and then Cliff Brown.
My name is Karen Kraut. My handwriting
Kraut,
is not
I'm
very
so
good.
sorry, another handwriting
okay.
F.
I'm a Lincoln parent. I live on Hawthorne Road. I have 2 kids at Lincoln. And I think for me, instead of repeating a lot of the excellent points that have been made, I think it's just really important to take a step back and just remember why are we facing an override vote at all? And the reason is because 30 years ago, we have a law that passed, a Tea Party style anti-tax law that we didn't support as Brookline in 1980, and a lot of us wouldn't support it now. So instead of our natural governing function of our local municipality assessing the goals and needs of our schools and our town services,
Karen,
and raising
would you talk into the mic,
and
please?
then raising or lowering revenue based on their assessment and you as our elected officials, we are stuck with a arbitrary limit on our ability to raise revenue that does not take into account the cost, how much things cost and how quickly things rise in inflation. So we're stuck with the 2.5% year after year, which is very insufficient when you consider that many municipal costs are rising well past 2.5%. The big elephant in the room is our school enrollment at 35%. So just as a recognition of the fact that we are voting on an override when what we really should be doing is just having our local government take an assessment and increase or decrease revenue as needed. So every year, 2.5% inflicts upon us an insufficient budget. So 7 years now, we're in an insufficient budget because of an arbitrary cap. And so now we're asked to make up for that with an override. And so instead of an override being considered an exceptional thing that we have to grudgingly support after extensive justification, an override should be considered a regular part of our budgetary process because we are put in this position that none of us asked to be in. And it's the way we right the annual wrong of a cap that is totally arbitrary. So just keep that in mind. That's what the override is. It's our job to override it and right an annual wrong that is inflicted upon us by a law that Brookline didn't support in 1980. So just keep that in mind. And then in terms of my particular opinion on this, I think schools should be fully funded. And I think the question of the pyramid, I've been persuaded by my fellow parents and others here that I think having one question on the ballot probably is a good way to go. But in my opinion, I think if you're really asking that question, you should ask it with professional strategists who do some polling and maybe focus groups. If you really want to know what might be more successful, I think you might want to go that route. And then additionally, I would say that I'm not so worried about an amount being too high to pass, because a campaign for an override passes on the values and the message. It doesn't pass on whether something's a little more or a little less. It passes on the whole campaign and the message that you're getting across to the voters. So I don't really think, I think if we do a good campaign, the values that we're imparting are going to pass regardless of the amount, unless it's like insanely excessive, of course. But if it's between a little more and a little less, I don't think that matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter to people individually and the money doesn't matter. I'm just saying your campaign, the merits of it really will pass on the message and the values you're imparting. And then as far as the debt exclusion, I agree that it's important to borrow money when it's cheap, have wiggle room in your capital improvement budget, and at the same time, just on a side note, and I'm not fully informed about this, but I have some concerns about the amount of the devotion project that I personally are not resolved yet. I'd need to learn more, but it does seem, I'm concerned about that. And I think if I'm concerned and I'm fairly informed, I can only imagine how other people are probably concerned too. So as a side matter. So that's generally my opinion.
Thank you. Cliff Brown is next, and then Alan Christ.
Cliff Brown, 9 Hyslop Road. Our school's enrollment growth in recent years presents fiscal challenges for the town and has put difficult choices on the table. We can view these difficult choices as a test of leadership. Will our elected officials do their job and run our town with fiscal prudency and maintain the financial strength that has given us the reputation of being well-managed? One view of leadership here would be to tell the voters that every penny sought under an override is truly needed, that all non-override options have been exploited and exhausted, and that we simply have no choice. Regrettably, that statement would not be true for the type of ballot questions that you are apparently planning to offer. Another view of leadership would be to tell the voters and municipal departments that there are steps that can be taken, sacrifices that can and should be made in order to provide what's needed via a mix of new funding and some belt-tightening by everyone. Leadership should include being able to persuade the PSB to advance its goals in part through policy and/or program modifications, and deferring some enhancements to recognize, for the greater good, that such steps are warranted because additional large school overrides are foreseeable in the near future. None of these views of leadership are discernible in what you seem to be on the verge of offering up. Instead, what we are witnessing is an opaque process from both groups of our highest elected officials, a process that has failed to answer basic questions raised by the OSC. Brookline voters are about to receive an override offering that's had no rigorous review, lacks the context of a larger, well-defined plan, panders to certain interests, and gives no material choice between higher and lower cost options. In my view, what we're looking at instead is some nifty financial sleight of hand, accompanied by half explanations, misstated facts, and refusal to answer questions. For example, the collective bargaining assumptions presented as a modest annual increase in wages of 2% or less, but this benign-looking figure fails to disclose the true picture. Guaranteed steps cause the real increase in wages to exceed 18% for many employees. Likewise, there's no taking into account the fact that 83% of Brookline healthcare premiums are paid by the town, considerably more than our so-called comparable communities. I believe you should stay at 1%, at least for those who still get steps, until you fund a study of total compensation that proves we need to offer more to be competitive in our hiring practices. Frankly, without that data, you and the PSB are working blind. It has been publicly suggested that the OSC majority position is essentially a plan that calls for more overrides in 2 years. Yet the very first page of the OSC report states that both the majority and minority plans were for 3 years, the number of years the Board of Selectmen limited us to, despite the desire of many committee members to look further out. The entire OSC foresees the likelihood of a need for additional overrides. To remain relatively silent on this point is to mislead the voters, as it is to imply that there has as yet been no increase in staff during the period of enrollment growth. People have asked for explanations for how you got from A to B. In other words, what answers did you get from the school officials to the questions raised by the OSC that convinced you to come up with these numbers? As of today, that information, which should be public, has not been forthcoming. What we now have is a situation where you, are essentially giving the schools 100% of what they asked for, including the enhancements that go beyond funding for population growth. There are additional dollars being added to perhaps make sure that certain other CIP projects get funded. Municipal departments are being allowed to say no to suggested changes. In other words, it's business as usual and everyone is getting what they want. People need to understand that over the next 5 years, they are likely to be facing substantial further tax increases to deal with issues like the high school, Hancock Village, and a potential additional K-8 school, as well as the fact that renovations to Driscoll and Pierce are not in any financial plan. Leadership, full disclosure, fiscal restraint, and options are what we need. Otherwise, the economic diversity of this town will suffer. Our commercial areas will become more homogenized, and some of the Brookline values that everyone speaks so proudly of, welcoming people of all ages, races, and economic backgrounds, and providing services for the mentally ill, hungry, and aged, will be put in jeopardy. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan Christ and then Roberta Winitzer.
Hi, my name is Alan Christ. I'm a Lawrence parent of 2 kids, a town meeting member in Precinct 4, and I live at 117 Kent Street. I'm glad to see, I would disagree about options. I think we've been drowning in options for the past 3 years in B-Space in this process, and I'm glad to see that we're finally honing in on something focused that will fund our schools fully and keep Brookline, keep education as a priority in Brookline. I just wanted to quickly state that I support Plan 1, A plus D, the 8.9 million bundled override, and the 49 million devotion debt exclusion. I feel that the real tsunami we're facing is the growth in enrollment. As everyone has said, it's climbed 35% since 2006, and the operating override will fund the teachers and staff required to support this population and keep our schools the best. It'll fund technology, the world language programs, special education, ELL programs, all the things that make our schools great. And then secondly, to speak to the CIP funding, I think it's very important to maintain capacity in the CIP to allow future flexibility in addressing overcrowding problems in the schools or cost overruns as they arise on other projects, while not starving other town infrastructure and resources such as our parks and streets. And then thirdly, I just wanted to say that I'm one of many parents, I think, in the town who will work hard to get this override passed, because I believe very strongly that the health of our schools is tied directly to the health of our town. And if we have great schools, we have a great town. And I think making that point to people is what we need to do to get this passed.
Thank you. Told Roberta Winitzer's left. Roberta, you're not here. Roger Blood, you're next. After Roger, we'll hear from Carrie Staff.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Roger Blood. Let me start by saying that I agree with Marty Rosenthal, just to get your attention. When he said that the voters should be given a real choice, that would assure that something that's definitely needed will happen, but also it would reflect the value of the Override Study Committee's report, which gave you a very solid and defensible basis for putting on the ballot two distinct choices. What we're looking at here, pyramid choice, those aren't really choices. Those are distinctions without a difference. They reflect maybe differences among you individually, but those aren't the kind of differences that belong on the ballot. The campaign debate will then be who's for or against technology, and that really isn't what this is all about. If a choice is not to be offered, then the study committee's report, which, by the way, if it had been done by a private consultant, I think if the firm I just retired from had done a report of that caliber, would have been worth over $500,000. And we got it for free, and we had dedicated citizens that we would like to have continued interest and continue to be willing to step up and do that kind of work. So I think that they should be given more than a thank you. They should be given some deference on the rigorous process that they went through. If there is only one question, and that is one that could not be divisive for the community, then it should be finding some middle within the range of what was presented so thoroughly by that committee. However, unfortunately, it appears that prior to this public hearing, reading last week's tab, the Board of Selectmen has taken essentially both of those completely off the table, and that's why we're here talking about a few $100,000 difference of these different plans. That's a disappointment, really. In 2013, I attended one of the early B-Space meetings here in this room, standing room only, and a lot of people speaking, a big range of views. And at that hearing, maybe some of you remember it, I think maybe Selectman Goldstein might have been chairing it, there were two officials, school officials, one present and one former, that gave very rousing speeches that got the loudest applause of the night. And those messages were basically, one I'll quote, "Shoot for the moon," and another which essentially was, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste," that an override is an opportunity rather than a challenge to get everything we've always wanted and dreamed of. Think big. Now, I don't fault the school officials for doing that. That was their job, but I don't think that's your job, and I really would hope that you would apply some more rigor to what you're calling fully funded, which is really not an even-handed term. That's not as any more fully funded than what the Override Study Committee's recommendations are. We know that whatever happens in May, that future override asks are going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We know that, but most of the voters don't. And you've heard, and I agree, that that should be put out in very stark terms, because that's what's simply going to be happening. It's not 30 cents a day, so much as 3 to 5 years from now, whatever your current tax bill is, it will be 25 or 30 or even 35% higher, all in, when one considers Hancock Village, the high school, and other required projects. Former Selectman Charlie Ames, who some of you remember, and many people here may, if your hair is gray enough, he said something in preparation for a previous override campaign that I think was as valid then as it is today. And it was one of the only times I ever saw that gentleman get excited. He said, in effect, that if you put more dollars than necessary into a general permanent override, it doesn't really matter what the advocate's stated intentions are. These new funds immediately become fair game for higher collective bargaining demands. In other words, if it's there, you finish the sentence. On candor, please don't divert or confuse the voters' attention by commingling a public works sweetener with education funding. For the past year, no one's asked for this, no one's analyzed it, and while I don't question your sincerity, this is kind of a campaign tactic that does invite cynicism from a lot of voters. Until last week, I was really hoping to join a yes campaign, and one that would support the schools, acknowledge the enrollment growth, and cut nothing. Basically, a version of the majority, even if slightly enhanced. And it's really unfortunate that that's not being offered or even discussed tonight, and probably won't be during the campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. Carrie Staff, and then Sarah Kitterman.
Hi, my name is Carrie Staff, and I have a 10th grader at the high school and a 7th grader at Devo who will spend her 8th grade at Old Lincoln next year. I've been a resident of Brookline for 15 years, and in that time, the value of my condo has doubled. My 2 children are getting a great education, and our family has benefited from, for the most part, excellent town services delivered by responsive town employees. All of these factors combine to make Brookline a highly desirable place to live, which in turn continues to support our property values. We cannot expect to benefit from this if we don't pay for them with our taxes. I feel that property taxes in Brookline are well justified, and that is why I support Plan 1A and D, the bundled operating override and the higher debt exclusion. If I read the fairly confusing override grid of options correctly, it seems that the difference, as others have pointed out, between the most and least expensive options in Plan 1 is only about $53 a year for single-family homes and about $16 a year for condo owners. The differences for Plans 2 and 3 seem to be even less. While originally I thought it would be a good idea to offer voters a pyramid structure so they could indicate their levels of support, these small differences are not sufficient to risk presenting a confusing ballot that will already contain 2 separate measures. I've seen the changes in the schools in recent years, which concern me. At Devo, class sizes have grown, and librarians and math specialists have been cut. A little internet research on the impact of class size led me to a meta-study which concluded that small class sizes, particularly in the early grades, combined with experienced teachers, were the 2 largest influences on student success. I saw this firsthand when my oldest daughter was in 1st grade. Her class received several additional students in early September, as is common at Devotion, and it grew from 19 to 24 students, which at the time was well beyond the targeted size for 1st grade in Brookline, although it seems to be fairly common now. I watched one of Devotion's most experienced and well-respected teachers struggle to maintain the high level of teaching and personal attention which she normally provides. It is unfortunate that we find ourselves needing to ask for operating funds at the same time as we need capital funds. And it's unfortunate that we need to ask voters for more money. We will have to ask for more money to fund the high school and possibly another school. But this is where we are. Brookline now has 35% more children enrolled in our schools than when my kids started kindergarten. These children are already here. They're in our schools now, and we must provide appropriate facilities in which to educate them as soon as possible. The larger debt exclusion will fund both the Devotion Project and short-term solutions at our other overcrowded schools until a long-range plan for them can be put in place. The smaller debt exclusion runs the risk of either shortchanging Baker and Pierce's pressing needs or putting additional stress on the town side of the budget. Whether we are parents whose children have already benefited from Brookline's excellent teaching and smaller class size, parents who are just joining the Brookline school system, or residents who are benefiting from increased property values and the quality of life here in Brookline, we owe it to this next generation of children to give them the same quality of education that the town has provided in the past. I will happily pay the extra $200 to $300 that will be levied on my condo. And when it comes time in the next few years to pay for the high school expansion and possibly a 9th elementary school, I will support that too. My family has benefited from what Brookline has offered its residents over the past 15 years, and I want to be sure Brookline can continue offering that same quality of education and level of town services. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah Kitterman, and then Jennifer Amigon. And then, can I ask people, it's, we were hoping to conclude here, I was originally hoping to conclude by 9:30. That's not going to be possible, but I would like to try and conclude by 10. So if we can try and limit to the 3 minutes, that would be best. So when you see the 3 minutes go up, that means please conclude. Thank you.
I'll be brief. I'm Sarah Kitterman. I have 3 children who have gone through Devotion spanning 10 years. I feel like I can echo what the Pierce parent said earlier, that I really have sensed the last few years a real tipping point at the school. And I have seen an enormous change from my current high schooler, the experience she had coming in, and my current elementary school daughter. And the experience has been different. I mean, the woman who spoke about her child having no difference between having 17 and 24 is really wonderful, but I can't say the experience has been the same for me. My daughter, who is in high school and had a class size of 19, 20, 21 at Devotion, with many more specialists, supports with librarians, pullouts, guidance counselors who could organize friendship groups, had a really fundamentally different experience than my current daughter, who's had a class size of 25 and 26, and I see it in the face of the teachers when I walk in, who have less time for the students, more complex classes, more difficult, challenging environment, and less support. I see the older, more experienced teachers leaving. I see them frenzied and stressed and tired, and we all, I think, sense it, that it's at a tipping point. I just really believe that. And I support a larger override. I sense in the comments there's a lot of clearly frustration with the process. I think there's a lot of trust issues clearly that have come to play. But I think if we look historically at the way the budget has been managed, I think we show a history of, I think even Mr. Benka referenced that the budgets have been conservative. I don't think we've seen a real issue of overspending or excess unneeded spending in the school budget historically. I think it's really imperative that we also catch up, and not just catch up for numbers, but also deal with high school and also what we're going to be dealing with these larger schools and different structures. I think that the 5-section school at Devotion at Pierce fundamentally are going to need some different overhead administrative structure, and I think it's going to be a different funding needs than just the number of teachers and support staff. I support the larger override, and I also support not overcomplicating it with a pyramid. I think it's complicated, and keeping it simple, I think, is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Amagone, I hope you said your name approximately right, and then Lisa Sheehan after that.
Hi, thank you for having me tonight. I'll try to keep this brief. My name is Jennifer Amagon. I've lived in Brookline for over 10 years with my husband and 3 children, 2 of whom are at Pierce. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Pierce PTO, but I'm speaking from my personal experience. So I've heard a lot tonight about educational excellence in our schools and the tipping point that we're reaching. And a lot of it is a lot of observational data. I should say I also work in education, and I mine educational data. So last year when MCAS came out, I went right to the state website and poured through our district's data, and I was really shocked to see what our outcomes look like. I felt like I stumbled upon a dirty little secret that, once I started talking to people, again, we're early in the schools. My oldest at the time was only in 2nd grade. What I really want to concur with what I've heard is our teachers, our staff are outstanding. Class size isn't the only issue. It's really about differentiation, right? All the support staff that we need to truly get to the needs of all our diverse learners in the system, and our system's getting more and more complex. And so really looking at it from that perspective, that's really what's getting eroded. And I heard Dr. Lupini at one point say that educational excellence is getting compromised in our system, given that we're not fully staffing up to national staffing ratios. So I just want to make that point. But to the woman who spoke earlier, not in favor of the override, who said she put two of her daughters went through Runkle. There were good teachers, there were bad teachers, whatever. I just want to pull up a piece of data about Runkle that was from 2013. So in 2013, Runkle in 5th grade English was 565th out of 879 schools in the state. That's not excellence. So if you look at the data and you see the trends that are happening from our educational outcomes, we're past that tipping point. If you look at MCAS data from, in our K through 8s over the last few years, we're stable or we're declining. So I just urge you to look at what our educational outcomes have been. I can go on and on. There are many schools in this district. Devotion in 2013, 598th out of 955 schools in 3rd grade math. That is not educational excellence. So I just want to point that out and urge you to, I didn't say what I was supporting, I should have started with that, to fund 1A with the debt exclusion D to fully fund our schools. We are past that tipping point. We are truly in a crisis situation. We have excellent staff, and we need to be able to differentiate for all the needs of our learners. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Lisa Sheehan and then Brian Sheehan.
Hello, I'm Lisa Seraphin Sheehan, and I'm a 30-year resident of Brookline. I'm a graduate of Brookline High School, and I served on the Override Study Committee, so I've seen all of you before. I was part of Group 2, which recommended a higher level of funding, and I'm not going to go through all of the points on that. I think Beth Jackson-Stram really covered the recommendation, but I wanted to be on record in this forum as supporting option 1A with the full capital debt exclusion as well. I just want to make a couple of points from things that I've heard. One is I just want to make very clear to everybody that nobody on the Override Study Committee, no matter what group they were in, found any evidence of mismanagement, and I think it's been said here, everyone has agreed that the town is run extremely well, the schools are run extremely well, and that this request is entirely 100% driven by enrollment. And so that's an important thing to remember. This issue of differentiation is something that we see in our school every day. Brookline, and I say this as a former student, has a wide variety of learners. We have people who are third generation Brookline students. We have people who are just learning English. We have students who need more of a challenge. We have students who need more support. All of these students, they deserve the best education that meets their needs. And Brookline, we've moved to Brookline so that they're able to get that. And what we've seen is, as classes get bigger, and again, others have said this as well, as classes get bigger, teachers have less opportunity to provide individuals to support. And as schools get bigger, the administration, the guidance counselors, and everybody else has equal difficulty providing the individual support that students need. So I think it's very important to fund, the difference between enhancements and catch-up. I think everybody who was on the Override Study Committee and anyone who followed it is very clear that it is a distinction that doesn't mean much. These are all things that we've fallen behind on due to growth. And, technology, if I could just say something about technology, we are far behind in technology. I mean, you can pick a kid in almost any district in this state, any district in this country, and they have better technology than we do. And, we have to come to grips with that. It's not an option, and I do think it should be bundled. There's this concept that we can lower the override amount by sort of picking and choosing and cherry picking what kind of programs or how much guidance counselors to fund and how many different things to do. But the truth is, it is the superintendent and the school committee that make those decisions. And, everybody would cherry pick differently. Everybody would choose a different program. And we all have different things that are important to us. What people value in a Brookline education is the fact that we provide all of these things for all of our students. I just want to talk about the...
You're at 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. In terms of the tax impact, I agree with what's been said here, that the difference between the ones that we're looking at on this chart is not very great to the individual homeowner. But the difference in absolute dollars, which is, $1 million, $1.3 million, I mean, pick whatever number it is very meaningful to the programs. And I think that's an important thing to remember. We get a lot of bang for the buck individually, whether it's $50 or $70 in incremental on these options for another $1.3 million in programs that I think have been demonstrated that they're needed. On the capital, again, I'll just do that quickly. Obviously the schools are overcrowded. We need to address that. There will be more overrides for a night school or for the high school for sure, although we'll be rolling off the previous high school, which is important to remember. I do think, we need to fully fund devotion, but we also need to provide funds for projects in the interim to bridge the bigger solutions. And that's something, I know that there are some ideas of what those small projects would be. They're going to have to be something, and we need to have money to fund those options. The last point I want to make, and I know I'm running, is this issue of capacity to pay and this issue of economic diversity. And I think it's really important to remember that, you know, that there are people in Brookline who do pay more for their housing than is, you know, that more than 30%. But I think it's important not to judge those people's motivations and why they're here. I think some of those people, you know, we should not speak for them. I think some people have spoken for them.
5 minutes.
I think some of them are people who have put every cent they have to be able to give their child a Brookline education, and some of them are reaping the benefits of having increased equity in their homes, which they value. And so those people, even though they fall into that category, would also value the strengthening of schools. So I support the full amount. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Sheehan and then Kim Schellenberger.
Good evening, Brian Sheehan, Mason Terrace in Brookline, town meeting member, school council member at Driscoll School, and parent of the same two children as Lisa Sheehan at the Driscoll School. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you on the Board of Selectmen, to the Override Study Committee, the B-Space volunteers. As an Override Study Committee widower last year, I can tell you there was a lot of time put into that. And as somebody said earlier tonight, I think you probably really underestimated gravely what that value was, but certainly no less than $500,000. I suspect it's quite a bit more than that. So I want to thank everybody for the time that's been invested, and to point out to folks that as a result of that, I think it's easy for people to say, to just kind of paint with a wide brush that there's waste in government. It's a popular thing that we hear everywhere, on TV, reading papers. It's sort of part of the everyday vernacular in America. And I think that we've seen, I know I've had the opportunity to see it through Lisa's work on Override Study. I think we've seen that it's been proven that we really don't have that waste here. So kudos to all of you and to everybody in our town government for running a tight ship. And then I guess I should make my overall point here is that I support strongly Plan 1A. I think anything that's worth doing is worth doing all the way. And coming up short of the mark seems to me to be really abandoning the opportunity and also shirking the responsibility at this time to go the distance. And we know that the trend is such that the growth is not going to stop. We saw just last year the pro forma for the enrollment for kindergarten was exceeded. So we didn't have the ability to pro forma the enrollment for the fall of 2014 in the fall of 2013. And just knowing that that is a trend that's been ongoing now for several years, there's no reason to expect that it's going to stop anytime soon. So falling short of the mark right now, I think, sets us up for the certainty of having to go through this again in just a couple of years. So I ask that we move forward with Plan 1A. I'd further ask that we have just the one option on the ballot. I think I sent an email to everybody on the board in early December saying the same thing. I think that anybody that's ever gone into a fast food restaurant to order a soda and you get up to the counter and they say, what size would you like? What does everybody always say for the answer is always medium, right? Because you haven't really thought about the answer to that question. You get up there, well, I don't want to say small, I don't want to say large, I'll say medium. I think that's what we'll end up with. If there is an option, the small is the no, the fully funded is the large, and the lesser funding is the median. I think it will be a vote that would be by default. People will go with that. And I think it's going to leave us far short of the mark. So I ask that you lead us by starting with a ballot that has just one option, which is really up or down, override or not. And again, I thank you for the time and commitment.
Thank you. Kim Schellenberger and then Kathy Hitchcock. Either of them here?
Oh, Kim was actually named for us. She had to go home, but she's also planning on it.
Okay. We'll take your word for it. Kathy Hitchcock, or Kathy here? And then Jessica Wando-Shubo after that. Is still here. Well, I know is still here.
Good evening. I'm one of the later people to speak because I'm a teacher at Brookline High School. I also live in town. My partner's a town meeting member, and our three kids have either gone through, or our youngest is currently a sixth grader at Pierce. We've been in the town for 18 years. But as I said, I'm speaking late tonight because earlier I was over at the Smokehouse donating $65 of my money so some of our kids in the high school can take the Sojourn bus trip down south to visit some of the most important civil rights places. There are kids who can't afford to go, so I wanted to go and make sure that they could go. So that's why I'm kind of last on the list tonight, one of the later people. So, as I said, I'm a teacher at Brookline High School. I'm a math teacher. Like Bob Miller earlier, I am also a career changer. I have an MBA. I work for a Fortune 100 company. I'm not here, however, to talk about the numbers. I'm here to talk about the teachers. First of all, I want to say that I support the maximum tax override possible. We need this for our children. I personally co-teach 2 classes where over 50% of the students are on IEPs. It's a co-taught class. All the literature, however, including the models, say that the best co-taught model works with kids that are only 25% on IEPs. We teachers are working hard to do the best we can, but we're limited by the number of classes that are given to us at the high school and the teachers allowed. Now, if I had one of my kids and I knew what the literature said about the model, I would be up in arms about what's going on. We are doing the best we can, but we are limited. The next thing I want to say is I also teach honors classes. My honors classes are almost 30 kids. And again, I'd like to say with 100% confidence that I'm meeting all of their needs, but I can't. I wish I could, but I can't. We are working hard, again, to do the best that we can, but again, we are limited by the number of available teachers. I think that we've got strong, intelligent, dedicated teachers who are the backbone of this system. As enrollment continues to escalate, I would ask that you please ensure your children and my children get the quality education for which Brookline is known. My salary as a teacher is equal to the minimum required age of living in Brookline. All right? It's tough to make ends meet, but I will tell you right now that I would gladly pay more in taxes to support the Brookline schools. The last thing I want to say is that we now, I don't know if Care 11 is still here, we have, and I have, and my co-teacher has, found about homeless kids here in Brookline. They are now staying in Brookline, and they are getting an education in Brookline. So please, if you said that earlier, that is no longer the case. If you start your education in Brookline and you're homeless and you don't have a place to stay, at the high school, you are there. So I just want to make sure that we have come a long way. So, thank you.
Thank you. Jessica Wender-Shubo. And then I've got Diana Nygren after that.
Thanks, Kathy, for stepping up with some details of what I want to say. My name is Jessica Wender-Shubo. I went to the schools from nursery school through high school in Brookline. I now serve as the president of the Brookline Educators Union, so I'm on leave as a history teacher. I've heard the members of our central administration, Dr. Schmuckler, Dr. Lupini, Dr. Fisher-Mueller, and tonight I heard the coordinator of K-8 World Language, Don Carney, speak publicly about how our educators have been working longer days and squeezing out every bit from every minute of an ever-lengthening workday. Of course, we don't always agree, and I probably don't have to mention that, but I'm proud to stand with those colleagues in the central administration who have credited our teachers with absorbing the shock of understaffing. Classroom teachers, caseload specialists today are designing and implementing programs and new curriculum. They're developing and implementing new curriculum for Common Core standards, working intensively with literacy coaches, integrating world language into the school day with world language teachers, prepping for multiple grades using continually changing curriculum, as Don Carney noted just earlier tonight in the school committee meeting. Teachers are working incredibly hard. Our classroom educators and caseload specialists are integrating students, has been mentioned, very importantly, that were in outside placements. They're dedicating themselves to the inclusion of those students, differentiating instruction for those and other students with special needs, and giving them the care and the personal attention that they and their typically developing peers deserve. Now, I trust I don't need to tell a single parent or grandparent in this room, or a single specialist, teacher, or paraprofessional, that every child, no matter what their age, knows the difference between true personal attention, others have referred to it, and being attended to by a piece of technology. Yes, we benefit from using computers, but unmanageable workloads can lead to increasing reliance on standardized, prefabricated software and other materials. Yes, encouraging students to work in groups is tremendously valuable, but not at the expense of staffing sufficient to enable skilled and caring adults sufficient time to interact with each and every child as he or she feels respected, cared about, truly understood, and inspired to dare to stretch and take intellectual risks. I have never met a parent who said, "I don't mind if an algorithm dictates what schoolwork my son or daughter needs in order to grow." Somewhere in the district today, you will find a teacher squeezing a meeting into her class time, a paraprofessional serving as a one-to-one aide. At the same time, he is an aide for the entire class. Comments on a writing assignment sacrificed to the compiling of data the student will never see and the administrator doesn't have time to review. I'm almost done. This evening, you will see signs of a society where parents have to pay for enrichment and extra help that teachers have no time to offer their students or children, their own or the ones they teach. An overload might be squeezed out of teachers for a while, but not indefinitely. So asking educators to continue to manage today's caseloads, intensive workloads, on any scale of enrollment is hurting children, and just expanding it, the same model, larger, isn't going to solve that problem. It's breaking the hearts of the teachers I talk to every day. Happily, we're committed to this legacy of public education, and we'll fight for it. We really will. I'm going to end by simply parenthetically saying, to those of you who don't like step raises, I have a suggestion. Start the teachers at the pay that they are deserving of, and you won't have to worry about the steps. Start them at the top, and see if that isn't a fair wage for the professionalism they deliver. Those steps were invented by administrators to save money and get a clear way forward. Those same administrators, by the way, were for tenure because they realized that fair treatment of teachers is a good way to strengthen the profession. And with that, I'll get to work on helping this override. Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Diana Nygren, and then the last speaker I have signed up is Nathan, and I'm sorry, Nathan, but it looks like Shepton, Payson Road. And if there's anybody else who wants to speak, this is absolute last call. You still got to get your name on a sign-up sheet, so come forward. Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Nygren. I have lived in Brookline now for 17 years and have 3 children in the schools. I have an 11th grader who started out in kindergarten at Devotion and is now at the high school. I have an 8th grader at Devotion and a 2nd grader at Devotion. So I have watched, as someone said previously, I have watched the quality of what my kids are able to receive deteriorate dramatically and noticeably in front of my eyes. And the 35% growth to some extent doesn't even capture the fact that my 11th grader, when he was at Devotion, there were 66 kids in his class. My 8th grader, there are 88 kids in her class. My 2nd grader, they came in with 120 kids. So nearly double the number of kids in the same building. And there are more sections. They've added more teachers, but there haven't been added guidance, there haven't been added any number of supports needed for those kids. And, you know, the Devotion renovation was being talked about when my 11th grader was in kindergarten. So it really is a very serious catch-up that we're trying to do rather than an improvement on an existing working system. I'll also note that when my now 11th grader was in 2nd grade, there were 2 kids in the grade who broke their legs and were asked to stay home for 6 weeks because the second grade wing of Devotion School isn't handicapped accessible. So that's what we're trying to overcome. I think it's not clear, maybe to all of the voters, the extent to which the buildings are not able to meet kind of the baseline standards of what should be acceptable for our kids. And I appreciate actually the fact that what you all have put on, all the proposals you've put on are so tight, because it suggests that the Board of Selectmen sees how critical all of these programs are, and I just hope that that can be made clear to voters. I also hope it can be made clear to voters that since there is a town-school partnership, even though what's on the overrides is school, that ultimately there will be, as someone said earlier, there will be town services cut if the override isn't passed, that it will impact more than just parents of students if it isn't passed, because the town is committed to trying to work with the schools and maintain excellence. Thank you.
Thank you. And is Nathan here?
Right here. So it's Nathan Spritz. I live at 44 Payson
Thank you.
Road.
Thank you.
And I thank you. Do I get to go till 10 o'clock? I'm tired too, so I'm not going to go through the litany of all the wonderful things that my children at Baker School get under the really under the extraordinary effort of Dr. Brown, who's sitting here right behind me. So we don't have to go into all of that, but Dr. Brown does a great job for us. I really came here just to talk about risks and why I think that we have to go with the largest override proposal and the largest debt exclusion possible. I see two risks. The first is that our population seems to grow faster than any consultant tells us it can possibly grow. And I see absolutely no reason to think that future projections are going to contain our actual populations when the future years actually get here. The second risk that I think that we face is that we have a number of debt exclusions that are going to be lined up after this first one for devotion. And I'm concerned that without really good leadership, that at some point one of those debt exclusions is going to fail and this entire process is going to come to a grinding halt. So I think, and I'm going to echo what a lot of speakers have said today, is that we have excellent, excellent leadership and really professional administration here in this town, and we trust you to do the best with our money. Trust us to go with the largest debt exclusion possible. Trust us to go with the largest override possible. That's our choice. It's our choice to tax ourselves a little bit more so that we can bring back up to the highest possible achievement level all of our schools. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I share my applause for all of you. Everybody was so well-spoken and made their points, and I think we all listened very carefully. Thank you. We've enjoyed the public hearings and enjoyed the level of debate, and you'll be hearing more from us in the next couple of weeks. Good night, everybody.